Live. I am so excited, as I always am, for the Here For It Live. But I am here with Christine O'Donnell. She is the amazing human behind this beautiful studio that we're in. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Catherine.
Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thanks for having me.
I
It's fun to
find-
be sitting in the chairs
I
instead of
know.
like pushing
Yeah.
things around behind the chair.
Right. So you joined Palette like 3 months ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. And like one of the first things that we discovered about you is that you already had a successful podcast network and production company that you were running out of your basement.
Yes.
And you were like, big dream goal here is to have my own podcast studio
Yeah.
in Saratoga.
Yeah.
And I can't even take credit for this because I'm pretty sure it was Marcella, but she was like, "Oh, well, we can definitely do that like very soon."
Yeah.
So we reached out to the building owner here to see if there was any more space, and there was. And there's a lesson in there, like if you don't ask, you don't get it, right? So
Yeah. I mean, I feel like Marcella and I were like dating for a couple of years before.
oh right, y'all met at a coffee shop, right?
Yeah. I think we just met randomly in the streets of downtown Saratoga.
Okay.
And she found out. So at the time, I was producing a true crime podcast, and she was like, "Oh, I have a true crime club. It's part of Palette." And I was like, "Tell me more about Palette. What's Palette?" And at the time, I was working for the Downtown Business Association in downtown Saratoga, and I was like, "Oh, interesting." Like if I hadn't, because I had just started working with them because I was trying to get out of my basement. I was like, if I hadn't have done this, I would have joined Palette because my goal was to just feel inspired and feel like I was part of a community. And I
Right.
didn't feel that way just working from home all the time. And I think a lot of us felt that way
Yeah.
through the pandemic. And I also think that's one of the reasons that my podcasting business grew through the pandemic, because people were craving connection and community.
Mhm.
And I think that you can feel that or find that through conversations that you listen to via podcasting.
Yeah.
And you can have your hosts on your time whenever you want to talk about subject matter you care about. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I love podcasts because of that. I also am addicted to a good story. So
Yes.
I just want to hear it.
So back up a
Mhm.
little bit. You are a reporter,
Yes.
journalist by trade, by
I would say
education, experience.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that, and then leading up to like what brought you back to
Oh
Saratoga.
gosh, how much time do we have?
We have all the time in the world. The
Okay.
juiciness stuff is the best.
Goodness.
It's not even that juicy. It's just that like you boomerang back to the capital
Yes.
region, which is
So-
I love a good boomerang story.
So I was born in Saratoga Springs, Saratoga Springs Hospital. I went to 2 different elementary schools. Like, I'm a Saratoga person. And this was, I feel like, before I like knew what Saratoga was really like, because when you're still in elementary school and high school, I think you're just so in your own head. At least I was, in regards to, what am I going to wear today? Am I going to be able to talk to people? How are my grades? Like, I just was like so in my own head.
Yeah.
So anyway, I was really big into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as a child. Have you heard this story?
No.
No, but I loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And growing up, I had such a hard time relating to the princesses that were always on TV or in the movies. But April O'Neil, I could get behind her. She hung out with these cool turtles
Yeah.
and like ran around at night reporting the news on her city. And it seemed like she was making a difference. Plus, she wore pants. And I mean, that's way more practical than dresses all the time.
Yeah.
And she didn't have no glass slippers. Like,
Right.
she didn't need, like, she was working and doing stuff and so passionate and like having all these adventures. And I just was like, wow, I really love her. I could be like that. Also, I was born in the month of April, and my last name has an O apostrophe, like April O'Neil. So I just was like, oh, this is what I'm meant to be. I'm meant to be a reporter.
I love that.
I know I really should dress up like her for Halloween.
Well, you just had a kid's birthday party, right?
Yeah, I did.
So you have 2 beautiful children,
Mhm.
Asher and Ava,
Thank you.
and so you took that journey, right? Like you went,
Oh,
you
yeah.
became a
So
reporter.
I became a reporter. I
true-
worked in
True
Georgia.
crime.
I covered a lot of real crime stories, which isn't always the easiest thing. I would say it's just not the easiest thing. There was definitely a jading period for
Yeah.
me. And I just went up the TV news ladder to be working in Augusta, Georgia, to be then working here in Albany, New York, the station I grew up watching, which was kind of my dream in life before I had all these new dreams.
Yeah.
And so then I was out in Los Angeles and ended up working for a station out there for 2.5 years. Then I moved back to Boston and was working at a station there before my scandal hit. And then I lost my job and found myself like at the bottom of a half gallon of ice cream watching Gilmore Girls, pretty much on repeat until I was headhunted by a marketing company on LinkedIn. And I thought it was like a scam because I was like, how could anybody want me? Anyway, I was in a dark period.
Well, it's in that field, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're not reporting the news and you're not on camera, like do you feel kind of like, okay, this isn't what I signed up for?
To me, it wasn't necessarily about being on camera, which was also a little bit addicting, because there's this adrenaline rush that you get when you hear like someone live in your ear and they're like, okay, we're coming to you. And then you hear the anchor tossed to you and you're like, oh, I know I'm live right now.
Yeah.
And there's millions of people watching me here in Los Angeles. And then like it's you are accountable to tell the story of whatever just happened.
Mhm.
And you also likely just spent the entire day interviewing victims of a tragedy and then writing that story, putting the story together, working with your editor to get it on air in time for your deadline. So
Yeah,
there
there's a
is this
rush.
very
Yeah.
there was like a rush every day.
Yeah. And so if
And also
you,
a challenge every day. It was like
yeah,
every story was like, how am I going to get this person to talk to me on this awful day?
which
So
which I mean, I guess, yeah, perspective is everything. Like
Yeah.
not everybody wants to talk to a reporter
absolutely not.
and share their story.
No, and I think one of the reasons I now am in podcasting and am loving podcasting is because with TV news, you spend all this time interviewing a family, connecting with them on a really difficult day, probably the most difficult day of their life. And you've recorded this content and then you have to trim it all down to 2 minutes. And then you're just on to the next. And you feel like you've had this, like anytime you're talking with someone, you like emotionally bond with them and
Yeah.
you connect with them. And if they're opening up and bearing their soul to you, it's like now you want to be with them and for them for an extended period of time. But in the TV news industry, there wasn't as many follow-ups as I would have liked to because
Right.
sometimes the story just isn't the top story the next day.
Right.
And
Something else
so
happens. Yeah.
so it would be like 2 minutes and then on to the next. And every day it was just on to the next, on to the next. But with podcasting, we can still do that story, but we can stay in it for not 2 minutes. We can share 30 minutes or an hour and then do it again the next day from a new angle and a new perspective. And that way the audience can process something and connect with the people who are talking
Yeah.
on an ongoing basis. So it feels more ethical to me to do that. It feels
It's-
more like I'm building something that I
Yeah.
can be proud of instead of just a little bit and a little bit and a little bit and a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, like bits and pieces instead of,
Yeah.
and like, yeah, and you're able to go more in depth. You're able to build a stronger relationship with the stories and the people
Yeah.
behind those stories. Yeah, I love it. So as a podcast producer,
Yeah.
award winning,
Yes. Thank you.
what, and I'm sure you have to, like, for work, you're like listening to podcasts all the time, you're editing and whatnot, but what
Yeah.
podcast do you listen to?
Goodness. So I feel like lately I've been listening to The Daily Stoic. I am in this like growth mindset space. A number of the shows that I'm either in pre-production on or producing are in this growth mindset space. And so I find myself listening to growth mindset podcasts. So The Daily Stoic, Rich Roll,
Oh,
Mel Robbins.
I'll never forget.
Um,
I'll never freaking forget when I was like in this not like dark place, but ignorant space where I like wasn't really, if you can believe it, I was not into like all of the, the personal development, and I think the definition of personal development was Chicken Soup for the Teenage
Chicken
Soul.
Soup.
Do you remember reading
yes.
those?
I wonder if there's Chicken Soup podcasts. They have to be.
Surely they have come into the new
To the
world
fold.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and that was it. It was
Yeah.
like read that book based on the topic of whatever you're struggling with, and that's that. And my friend Sonia, actually, I remember when Posey was like little, and I was just like, I don't even know, like what do you like? What do you read? What do you listen to? And she turned me on to Rich Roll.
Yeah.
I love him.
Yeah.
And there was also this like, this is like totally not on topic here, but there was this other like thread of a lot of his episodes and people he would interview and stuff. And it's like, something bad really happened to like all these people. And that was the catalyst that like turned them into whatever they became,
Yeah.
So like that maybe there was like a car accident that paralyzed someone, and then that's like the thing that forced them to show up in this new way of strength and like inspiration. And I remember thinking like, nothing really bad has ever happened to me. Like I don't have this catalyst, so who am I to be that person in the world, to inspire and to be positive and optimistic. And
you don't need trauma to be talented.
you don't need trauma to
But I do think trauma fuels talent.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then I think there was like this other like awareness about, I have been through trauma, I am literally from New Orleans. I have lived through so many devastating hurricanes. Well, I was in college for Katrina, the big one.
Katrina, that's
and both Mark and I were in college, and we were all in school. And so, yeah, but everyone around us lost everything, So both of our homes our parents' homes were fine, but everything inside was like, I'll never get the smell of like mildewy, moldy, wet carpet out of my nose. But anyway, this is like this went off the rails here. But my point was I had like this epiphany when I was like listening to all of the Rich Roll, because he has like a couple of different podcasts and they are different themed and stuff. Yeah. And yeah, it was like an aha moment where it's like I don't need to like have something horrible happen to me. Or tragic to put myself out there and to tell my own story. And that's kind of like the beginning of what ended up happening with me.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk about.
Sorry. I'm about to dig in, Catherine.
We went off the rails a little bit.
No,
but this does it. There's like this thread that's coming to me is like all of the podcasts that you are in your network and the Bright-Sided network are just that. They're bright-sided, they're positive, they're optimistic, they're inspiring. Yeah. So tell us, why are you focusing on that?
I think that it's my brand. I honestly think that every time darkness happens, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that's my experience working in a trauma-based field for more than a decade, is that eventually there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it is frustrating. And also I have experienced trauma in my life. So I think that's maybe why I was attracted to the TV news field outside of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle story. I just realized that as someone who has experienced trauma, it was easier for me to connect with people and almost I can avoid processing my own trauma.
Shit. Yeah, to talk about other
when I'm just with them, it felt more like caring to do that. And I'm now going to therapy, so it's like I'm having all these like realizations, like, oh, that was me just avoiding processing my own stuff. But yeah, So yeah, I was attracted to the journalism field, and I think I stuck it out, and I became so good in that space because I just was addicted. I
Yeah.
think a lot of journalists feel this way, and and so now that I'm producing shows, I find that all of my shows come from like that starts with a struggle. There is something difficult that's happened to somebody, but they don't want to dwell on it and they want to move into and focus on the good that has come from the bad. And I think that innately people tend to think back at something awful that happened in their life. Like whether we want to or not, like maybe years later, we're like, well, if I didn't get fired from that job, this, and this wouldn't have happened.
Mm.
Or if that awful thing didn't happen, this, and this wouldn't have happened. And there are some awful things that happen that I don't think there's ever, I don't know, maybe there's no comeuppance, but I feel like life is like this happens, then this opposite thing happens, then this happens, and this other opposite things happens. And I tend to feel like everything is gray in the world. It's all just
Yeah.
and we're all have the ability to both be bad and good, right? Like, and I think that's one of the reasons we're attracted to so many stories. It's because I don't know. I feel like I'm starting to just go in a
This is
different
what it's all about, though. This is the Here For It Live. You just like we're
Different
talking about
life.
whatever we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
There is also like this thing about like, well, why does the news have to be so damn negative? And is it because that is what people tune into? That is what is attractive? I mean, we were having this conversation a little bit earlier
Yeah.
today about how like for me,
Mhm.
if I'm going to put myself out there and I'm going to talk about what's going on in my own life, in my own world, like it's just my way to spin it to be optimistic and positive and try to just be kind versus like I mean I think you've like I don't even watch the news anymore because it's just so depressing and you can
Yeah.
find other outlets to get the information in a way that is just
Yeah.
positive. And
Or
that's what we need more of,
that's
truly.
in a way that might not be as exploitive.
Yeah, I mean people are really struggling and I
Yeah.
think that maybe it's more difficult to be positive and so people don't go for it, but
It's like when you hear something on the news, and this for sure feels like a tactic all these years later. But when you hear something that's like, "Hi, this just in," but then if the reporter says something like, "All right, what you're about to see is going to be graphic, and we just want to let people know, like if you're at home, the following might be a little bit triggering, or that just please take care for the following video because it is hard to watch." And as soon as someone starts to
here's
say
that
things like that, they're like, "Oh my gosh, what are they putting on the news?" And then they start to like
lean
and
in.
they might have just been listening to the news, but then they might turn and actually face the TV screen and lean in because I think our curiosity as humans get the best of us. I think sometimes when we hear about something awful that happens to someone else, we think, what can we do in our lives to protect ourselves from that happening to us? Um, and I think that there's like a multitude of things that it's hard to necessarily put your finger on, but like if there's an earthquake or like something awful that happens that could affect your community or affect your family or affect your society, then it's like you need to know about it. But exactly what do you need to know?
Well, that's the other thing too, is like
Yeah,
because,
'cause
years
sometimes
ago,
you
yeah, we
don't.
wouldn't have known about, something happening in Turkey or happening in Ukraine and we just wouldn't have ever been notified or it would not have impacted us. Or it impacts you but you don't know why, right? So maybe prices would be
Mm.
different, inflation, whatever, but they're like, well, we don't know why because you're not informed. There's not 24/7 news. There's not, so there is like an overconsumption about things that I don't know, but you're a
Yeah.
reporter, so
Yeah,
I would love
I
to
don't
hear your
know.
perspective because you're probably more like the people need to know all the things and they can handle it. But I would say, nah, people can't.
I would
We're
say
overwhelmed.
nothing is black and white, like, it's all gray.
Yeah.
There's no, like, for example, um, I think that it is important to know what's going on, not only in your local community, but worldwide, because we have a responsibility as citizens of the world to be accountable for what happens to our world.
Mhm.
And so that's why voting is important. That's why, like, and people forget. And I almost feel like we're almost like numbed as a society is on purpose, like with scrolling or something, so that we're not paying attention. Because if we don't pay attention, things can happen without us being aware. And there's just, so it is important, I think, that we as citizens of the world and of our local and, national communities need to be aware of what's happening. That being said, I think that you should protect your mental health.
You should also be in therapy.
If you so for example, like after I had my son Asher, I was still in California, and that was when like the wildfires were happening in the northern coast, and there were some awful, tragic, traumatic stories that my husband was covering because he works in the news. And like some things we don't like, I just couldn't know. I just was like, don't tell me. I don't want to know because I am falling apart every day already. Like
Mhm.
I'm already so anxious. I'm already and so if there's a time in your life where you need to just back up and prepare, like, and I don't know, protect yourself from hearing what's going on, then do it.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to try and come back and at least get the bullet points. There is a great podcast called The Newsworthy. A colleague of mine, America Mandy, who is also a journalist, she started it. She's, I think, still lives in Los Angeles, but she started it, gosh, maybe 7 years ago now. And it's a really helpful show because it gives you the bullet points of
Yeah.
what's going on, but not necessarily the stuff you don't want to dwell on.
Yeah.
Like there are things that I've like seen that I wish I could unsee. Like there are like there's video I've taken that I wish I could untake, but I
Right.
can't.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, the
So,
video thing is like a whole new world.
but it is your responsibility as a journalist to
cover
take
it.
that video.
Yeah.
You've got to record it, whether or not you air it,
That's up to the
decide
newsroom,
later.
right?
But you've got to take the video because you're documenting history and it is a part of history. So you just, I don't know, it's all.
So, but
It's all
for
gray.
the positive
Mhm.
outlook
Mhm.
and feel good stories, you can listen to any of your network podcasts.
I would say that our shows don't always actually that's not true. They there might be a difficult story shared, or we might talk about something that is hard to hear sometimes, but we don't just stop there. We continue working through it. Um and I think that we can all be inspired by everyday heroes. Like there are heroes in our lives every single day.
Yeah.
People do good things for each other all of the
All
time.
the time. Yeah.
And sometimes when I'm in like a dark spiral, I just have to think like, what is one good thing I have seen today someone do for someone else, even though they didn't have to? And that that can, I don't know. For example, I started taking a weightlifting class.
Oh, where?
And
Where at?
at the
Oh, at the
YMCA.
Y.
And
Do you go to West Ave or Wilton?
I'm not great. It's that one.
Oh, okay.
Williams.
Okay.
The one that's right there.
Yeah. Got it.
That's West Ave, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to come with me.
Well, I asked because I literally had
Mhm.
never been to the Wilton Y before I enrolled my kids in gymnastics.
Mhm.
And it's wonderful there.
Oh, I haven't
It's
been
like
there.
not as
Yeah.
congested, and my kids they like the kids room in Wilton better. Anyway,
Good to know.
good to know.
We should
Local
check it out.
buzz. Okay, but you're gonna tell us a feel good something that happened at the Y?
So my so I have a weight trainer, and she hurt herself the other day. Or like she hurt her own, like she strained her own back while doing a weightlifting class for herself.
Uh-huh.
And my like second time I was coming to these class, I was 15 minutes late. I forgot my worksheet. I just was a really bad student.
You're a mess.
And I was a mess, and I was embarrassed, and like I like was anticipating like being shamed by this. But she was not like, I showed up, and even though she was in pain and probably didn't have the best day, she's like, "No, it's okay. Like, here's a backup sheet I made for you. Here, like, I can go ahead and like do all the math for you so you know what you're lifting today." And she just took the time to do this, even though she didn't have to. And then because I was 15 minutes late, it took me longer to complete everything. And I was like, I can just leave. I don't have to stay. Like, I can come like a different time.
Mhm.
And she's like, "Oh no, I'll stay." And she just stayed and hung out with me, even though she did not have to.
Yeah.
Um, and I just was like, wow,
Yeah. And
that
it's
was
not
really nice of you. You did not have to do that. I don't think she's being paid for extra time.
right. Yeah. I
Um,
I think too, it's interesting. I can observe, like I can tell the difference of people who like take note of kindness and gratitude. They have a gratitude practice. Like I can tell when someone
yeah,
does that shit already and someone who doesn't, like there's
yeah.
their face looks different. Don't you think? Like people
I
who have none of that going on in their world, they're miserable
I would
and they look
say
miserable. It's not that just they are. They look unhappy.
I think sometimes having a gratitude practice like takes time, and it's hard to be present, especially if life is so hard sometimes.
And it's hard,
Um,
like, if you've never done it before, like, if you're
yeah,
like, gratitude, I what do I be grateful for? And then,
yeah.
sometimes it's frustrating. I was actually talking to Jackie about this the other day, and she's like, "Yeah, sometimes you're, like, writing down the same stuff. I'm grateful for my health. I'm grateful for my kids." And even just saying it that way, you're like, "This isn't I'm not doing it right," But it takes practice, and you have to keep at it and stay consistent, and then eventually it really pays off because then you
Yeah.
just go throughout the day when shit does hit the fan and you're like, whatever.
I feel like I like through the pandemic was like doing this with forgiveness, because people tend to say like, "Oh, you should forgive. You should," and then harder said than done. Like, how do you really from deep down inside forgive someone else? And I was
It's
really
hard.
struggling with this. I'm like, how do I forget? Like, you can say, "Oh yeah, I forgive you," or "Yeah, I'm over it," but like not really be over it for an extended period of time. At least I have found, and I was really struggling. So I ended up like writing it on my mirror. So every time I woke up, like, so I wasn't angry, I just would start like talking myself through like I forgive this person, I forgive this, I forgive that thing that happened. And then it took me a while to get out of like victim mindset and take real ownership and like understanding of like the full compass of what happened. But anyway, it just like it
Well,
just takes practice.
it's like a
The muscle I
muscle.
had to
Yeah.
keep
And
on
and I
doing it.
think also I don't know about you growing up, but it's like
Yeah.
to be forgiving. It could also like, to me, was like, yeah, you're a pushover. You let somebody take
Mhm.
advantage of you, and you let them walk all over you, and you let them do it and do it and do it over and over again, and you don't learn or whatever. But it's like, as I have become an adult and a parent,
Yeah.
it's actually really a cool flex to be like, I forgive you. I didn't forget.
Yeah.
And that's the key, right?
Yeah.
To forgive and to not forget, and then you set the boundary to not be hurt again
Yeah.
or treated in that way, and you don't give that person the opportunity to hurt you
Yeah.
or
It
to, take advantage.
yeah.
It's a flex.
It's a flex because you worked that muscle.
How much fun is it though? How much fun is it though when something does like happen
Mhm.
and you're like mean girled or something, and then the next time you see that person you're like, you're awesome because you're like, listen, that water under the bridge. And this has happened, this I've had this experience where it's like they have not forgotten about it and they won't let it go, and it's like,
Yes.
we're good,
Yeah.
move on.
Yeah. I think that it takes time, but if you just keep working at it, and it might not feel like it's sinking in at first, but you just got to keep on working at it.
Yeah.
And it does feel good too. Like I see this in I don't want to put anybody on blast, but there's somebody very close to me that I see be like resentful of things, or like opportunities given to other people. and they could be like PO'd about it and then say mean things about that person. But that's not fair. Like, that's not fair to that person.
Yeah.
And I know it's like easy to be critical of that person because maybe they were given an opportunity that you weren't given.
Or
And
that you haven't gotten yet.
yes, or gotten yet. But I just think that it's just, there just isn't room for that in your life if you're trying to find a better version of yourself. And if you are like actively working on those things, and again, it takes time. It took me a long time to like get into therapy regularly. I literally just started going, and I'm
I know,
like
but isn't
old
it
now.
great? Like it feels good when you're in, and then when you start to notice everybody's in therapy. You're like,
Well,
I mean,
I think actually going to therapy is a privilege. Like, I think that, not to say yet. Like,
yeah.
I think that like
But there
it's
are also, I
hard.
know, but
It's
there are also
hard.
people who won't even attempt to go to
Yes.
therapy.
Yes.
And
And
I
they
don't
should.
find myself
Mhm.
surrounded by those types of people.
Yes.
So it's not because I'm not talking about the piece where like you don't have access to it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about like people who have the access and have the means and they still don't want to do it.
I think that as a society, we've probably all gone through a collective trauma over the past couple of years with everything that's happened with the pandemic and just beyond. Um, and I mean, there's just so much going on in the world. I don't,
Yeah.
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 So I think that it would be great if we could all find a way to process these things together and or get into therapy, but some people won't, one, and two, finding a therapist that fits into your health coverage is really hard.
Yeah.
Like even though I just started going to therapy, I was trying to go to therapy for months before
Yeah.
or years before I actually, well, I found one therapist, but that therapist ghosted me.
Oh, that's
Did I
annoying.
tell you that
Well,
story?
no, you didn't. But we
Okay.
had we did a couples therapist, and she was amazing and lovely. And it was like 3 months in, we were really getting into like, some good conversations and just getting working through things. And she's like, "I'm moving," and I'm like, "You're what?" Do you know how hard it was for me to get ourselves here?
Yes.
And now you're moving? I feel abandoned. It's like I have to work through this now with a new therapist. So anyway, tell us about your local. I mean, you have a handful of podcasts in your network.
Mhm.
And like how do you like figure that you're going to work with? So like cuz you do podcast editing and producing that like outside of that, and that's fine. Like I'm sure you're happy to edit anybody's podcast and help them
No.
show no. Never mind. So
I say this from experience because originally when I first started out as an entrepreneur, I would take anything anybody gave me. But being that I have to listen to these things and edit them. And if it's content I don't want in my brain, then honestly, I don't want to listen to it and I don't want to edit it. So if it's
wow.
not putting me in the right mind space, it's not something I'm going to edit. And
Actually, I love that because it's like it's also listen, you can't be, the saving grace for everybody, right? Like who are your
no,
people? Who are you going to work with
yes,
and work with those people alone, and then you can refer these other guys not because they're bad people or anything, but
no,
it's
it's
just not
just
on subject. You can
we have.
refer them to your I'm sure you are so well networked when it comes to the podcasting world. So you can just kick them up the road.
I tend to be the target demographic for most of the podcasts I produce.
Mhm.
Um, however, there there are podcasts I produce that I'm not the target demographic of, but I'm curious about how other people think. So I want that stuff in my mind.
Mhm.
So it just or so maybe that does make me the target like I a target demographic. It just kind of depends, but I will say no and refer out a podcast to another editor within my company, or I will refer it out to a different podcast company that
Mhm.
there might be a better fit for. And so I think that it's taken me a long time to get here because it is so scary as an entrepreneur thinking like, am I going to be able to pay my bills? Am I doing the right thing? holy crap, who do I think I am? Why am I doing this? Like my
Yeah.
brain spiraled for probably the first 2 years. And I went on different paths of like, what is my target offering going to be? What are my services? And I tried some things and was like, I don't like doing that. So I don't think I can make that sustainable or scale it. So I
Yeah.
need to find a different thing to do that will work for my personality and my business.
Yeah.
So
So you also have your own podcast
I do.
that is about podcasting.
I do. You did research,
Yeah.
Catherine.
Well, I mean, I pay attention.
I
There's
know.
like, I mean, it's live, but there's also, I think that there's anyway.
Yes, I have a podcast about podcasting. It's called Podcast Coaching with Christine. I have pod faded, so that means I'm not currently producing new episodes on that show. But if you are somebody who is thinking about developing or launching a podcast, I have produced 45 episodes about developing and launching and growing a podcast completely on your own. It's called Podcast Coaching with Christine. And I interviewed a lot of people who are now industry leaders. We didn't know we were going to be industry leaders when we started, but we stuck with it because we just saw the data that was showcasing that audiences really enjoy podcasts. And I don't think that they're going away anytime soon.
And what are some of those
Mhm.
statistics like or metrics? Like there are more people listening to podcasts than the radio.
Yes. So I would say one of the most striking statistics when it comes to podcasting regards to podcast ads. So podcast ads have to have a 54% return on investment for the advertiser. And I think the reason is because when people are listening to a podcast, it's because they have engaged and connected with the host of that show. And it's somebody they listen to and appreciate and respect and trust. And so there's just a higher likelihood that if they're talking about something, then the people are going to want to try it too.
Yeah.
And a lot of podcast hosts are a little bit like, I don't know how to say this, but like they only, not in all case, but a lot of podcast hosts, they will only do ads for things they truly believe in.
Yeah.
And so,
Or use themselves.
or use themselves. And so they just kind of are like, these are my requirements.
Yeah.
If I don't believe in the product, I'm not going to pitch it on my show just because it'll give me a paycheck.
Yeah.
So and I think that's really smart because that's how you keep your audience's respect.
Mhm.
And if you lose your audience's respect, you don't have a show anymore.
Yeah.
So I do think that's really important. And I think that's why there's that higher return on investment for podcast ads over any other kind of medium out there in regards to ads. There's about 2 million podcasts in existence. Not all of those podcasts are ongoing shows. So a lot of people think like, oh, everybody and their mom has a podcast. But it's not true. Some people podcast and then they pod fade like myself and they can't keep it up because they just realize it doesn't fit into their life, or maybe they don't have the passion for it, or maybe there's another project they started doing that brings them more joy. And so they just steer away from it. So there's a lot of podcasts that are in existence, but they're not all like live new shows every episode with updated content or updated ads.
So what do you have to say to somebody who's like, yeah, I want to start a podcast? I mean, you gotta educate us a little bit that it's easier. You can put a podcast out, but it may not be good because you're not working with like legit people who know what they're doing.
I think that everybody can podcast, but maybe not everybody should podcast. I think that it is important. I'm going to talk about a specific demographic. So if you're a business owner and you want to start a podcast, I would get really like clear on why are you starting a podcast and what are your goals you want to get out of starting a podcast. And I usually have a survey that I send everybody I produce a podcast with so we can get really clear on their goals and how to make the podcast fit into their current ecosystem so it's in line with their business and brings them more business if that's their goal. Some people are so stressed by their business, but they don't want to leave it. And so they're like, I just want to laugh more. I want happiness. I think this podcast could make me happy. And so I'm like, okay, like let's lean into that. And like if that's the goal, happiness,
Yeah.
like then let's figure out how to develop and produce a show that's going to make you happy.
Right.
And one of my favorite things about podcasting is getting the time, like it's almost selfish. Like I get time to just like sit and chat with you
Yeah.
and feel like I get to make a new connection with you or with anybody who I might be talking with over an extended period of time that I might not have gotten otherwise. So it
Yeah.
almost feels like a selfish excuse for me to bond.
Yes. I love it.
Yeah.
And vice versa, right? Like somebody
Mhm.
who's going to
Yeah.
produce a podcast with you, or use you to help them develop it is getting to know you too.
Yeah. And I would, if you are thinking about producing a podcast, just look at the different resources that are out there to help you. There's a lot of free things out there besides my podcast. There's other podcasts, there's YouTube, there's worksheets, like there's things to help you develop a format and a system so that you can get clear on what you're talking about. And I would make a goal for yourself. And if you're going to get started, I would start, and especially if you're doing it on your own, I would start with a seasonal show. So you're like, okay, I'm going to do 12 episodes for my first season. This is my goal. This is my start date. This is my end date. So you can be proud of what you produce. And then like towards the end of those 12 episodes, you can be like, wait a second, I actually really like this and I want to keep going.
Yeah.
Or you can be like, I tried it. It's not for me. But now you have these marketing materials that are going to live on forever. And you don't have to feel like guilty that you just kind of like left it hanging.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, is there anything else you want to add to the conversation? I'm so happy we did this. We've been working together for a while and we obviously supported you to build this whole thing out.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what happens next and what you continue to build and develop and like you got to create a new goal now because you got the podcast studio.
Yeah. I think that I would love to use this space for more than just podcast recordings. I would love to use it as a place where people can come in and record content. They can have, I feel like we have a lot of intimate conversations in here, whether they're recorded or not. Like, I feel like we always find ourselves like just going down a rabbit hole of
Yeah.
vulnerability.
Not just you. I mean,
no,
the other
just
day I walked
everybody.
people, I gave a tour of Palette
Mhm.
and 3 amazing women came through and they sat down. And I mean, I just like, I'm like, wait a minute, we're not even recording this right now. We're just like feeling all the feels and talking about all the things. So
Yeah.
it's something about the space that you've created and built out. And it's like very welcoming and comfortable. And
Yeah. I think it's the padding on the walls.
yeah, that's that. You got to have that.
Yeah.
But I think there's more to it. And it has to do with like just the energy that you're bringing to the space. And
Thank you.
it's exciting.
Yeah, it is very exciting. I would say if I have to add anything, Catherine Hover is in the process of developing a podcast, and it's called Seriously Catherine, because you're encouraging people to take their dreams seriously, but not themselves seriously,
Right.
which I love. You can take your dreams seriously, but you don't have to be super serious.
Right.
You can still have fun.
Yeah. This all kind of stemmed from like, so at the end of 2018, I was going to a women's conference and I wanted to stand out. And so I dyed my hair pink and with the intentions of like dyeing it back. And then I was like, I kind of like it. And then this is like very revealing about me and just as a person. My dad said something like, no one's going to take you seriously with pink hair. And I was like, Dad, no one took me seriously with blonde hair or brown hair or anything else. So I'm going to keep the pink. So it wasn't until recently I went and did, something different. But yeah, it's just like the moment that I acknowledged that like I am so much more comfortable being who I am out loud, not taking myself too seriously. I don't have it all figured out. I am not perfect. I yelled at my 5-year-old this morning, like everything's all right though. So
Yeah, you're like taking off like the expectations of
It's just
what it
so
means to be a
freeing.
successful
Yeah, it's just freeing because it's like
whatever.
once you do that, and then, it's not like you're not raising the bar, but it's like you're giving yourself the authority or the permission to just like go about it in your own way that is unique to you. And definitely you're gonna, expect to like fall on your face a couple times.
I feel like
But
you're
laugh
like
about it.
yeah, I feel like it's actually a great like for anybody out there who is suffering from imposter syndrome, which has absolutely been me. Like time in and time out, especially as an entrepreneur. I feel like there's a lot of imposter syndrome where you feel like you need to prove that you're worthy of whatever this thing is. And by not taking yourself seriously, it's like, ha, 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 screw imposter syndrome. I don't need that. And I can
Yeah.
still be
So, yeah, be a
amazing.
badass. But so
Yeah.
like the other part of this too is I think that I guess so in the last, so say 2018 is when I really started to discover what I would ultimately build into Palette, what is
Mhm.
today's Palette. You start to meet people who you're like inspired by, or aspire to be like,
Yeah.
and then you meet them and you're
Mhm.
like, oh shit, you are not who I thought you are.
Oh,
And not
wow.
not from a place of judgment, but there's just like this really strong piece of me where it's a disservice to people who are paying attention to what you're putting out into the world and what you're doing in your career and your life and all those things. It's a disservice to that audience to not be authentic. And so it's important for me when I'm out in the world and when I'm one-on-one, or I'm talking to anybody, that I'm the same version of myself that you see everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think that that's like a big driver for me to do this program, this podcast, this business, this life,
Yeah.
because I'm raising 3 little girls and I need them to grow up confident in their own skin and their own selves. And it's just imperative that they grow up knowing who I am and how I operate, and also the people who I surround myself are, they're the real deals. And I think not the stronger, but like the more present I have been in my own skin, the more success I've seen, the more attention and like people coming to me to work with me to collaborate has never been like that. Wasn't the way years ago when I wasn't as open. So I think I'm proving it out. I'm demonstrating like it's okay to be this way,
Yeah.
whoever you are, however you show up in the world. So I hope that doesn't sound like judgy, where I'm like, you're not who you said you were.
I think that it is really difficult for a lot of us to show up as our authentic selves on social media because then someone could hurt you.
Or maybe because you don't know.
Or
Maybe you just
or
don't know
you're
who you
still
are yet.
figuring
You're still
out who
figuring
you
out.
are.
I mean, and
Yeah.
I'm also that.
Mhm.
There are some things you think you know about yourself, and then life happens and you're like, "Oh, yeah, maybe I'm gonna join the other team now about on that, scenario." And but I believe and I try to be honest about that and not hypocritical, or people do change. People do change their opinions, their minds. Life experiences happen and it causes that. So, I don't know, just being authentically me is all I can do at
You
this
can
point
do.
in the game. So,
Check
anyway,
out Seriously Catherine when it
it's
launches.
we don't we're still working on it. It's a big project
It
to
is.
really, it's something I've never done before.
To
And
develop and launch a podcast.
to develop it, the research, the development, all that stuff. I mean, I remember when we started Here for It Live, the purpose of it was because it was live. I hated listening to podcasts that you listen to and you're like, okay, that was so scripted and everything was so planned out that it was almost fake.
Mhm.
It was actually a couples podcast that I was listening to years and years ago, and I was like, if if these if this is a disservice, right? Like this is an actual conflict that they've had that they're airing. It's like it just sounded and seemed to me so scripted. So I'm like, I'm never going to do something like that. I want it to be like off the cuff. I want it to be authentic. I want people to say what they're really thinking. And there's been times on the Here for Live program where I said something offensive, but that also gives me the opportunity to come back on and say, yeah, I didn't think about what I was saying and it offended some people. And this is, I do apologize. And now once you know better, you do better, right? So it gives you the opportunity to
learn,
to do that and learn out loud.
Yeah. Yes. Learning out loud. That is a scary thing to do.
Oh, it's so fun.
I don't think everybody feels that way.
But you can always just be like, oh, not like always be like, oh, I didn't know. But it's like, this is how it is, though.
I think that we live in a time where, like, I don't know if we want to open this box, but when we talk,
I know we're running out of time.
Cancel culture is a thing, and you just like people could say something they do not mean to say, or they said something where they didn't know better because they just haven't learned yet, but then they learn out loud. And so it does take bravery.
Well, this happened. I mean,
that's also how we learn as
that's how we learn
community and a society. So we need that.
And if you are the real deal, you can also apologize out loud and you can demonstrate, the other side of things, which I've seen done. And it's been remarkable. Like the world is not over when you're canceled. I mean, I've seen some people who have been canceled and they're like, you know what? I don't even want to do this shit anymore. I'm like happy to be canceled. I don't want to be out in the world anymore. I don't want to be on the scene anymore. And I want people to leave me alone.
Yeah.
I've seen that done locally and like nationally. And then I've also seen this other side of it, right? Where it's like, you said what you said, it was screwed up and you write a book about it. And it's like, everything's fine. I mean, I'm sure there's examples of it not being fine, but I don't want to focus on that.
What I just found myself waiting for is, what's her face who like bribed people to get her daughters into school. What's her name?
Becky. Aunt Becky.
Like I'm sure she'll have a book about her time in prison, or a feature film,
or a movie, book, movie,
a Lifetime,
the whole
original,
yeah.
Because I think we're all curious.
Well, again, we want to know.
What was it like, Aunt Becky behind bars?
Aunt Becky behind bars.
That's her podcast.
Well, listen, we are going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for tuning in for the Here For It Live, and we will see you again soon.
Yeah, actually. And if you want to find out more about Catherine's podcast or any of Bright Sighted's podcasts, you can go to our website, brightsighted.com, and I'll leave it for you in the comments below.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.